today we'll be introing JavaScript, and we will be doing it instead of just giving a boring old lecture. We will be building a game, and this game that we're going to be building is a simple rock paper scissors like simulator, you could say. So basically, there are two players. You click on Let's Play, and then there will be a randomly generated, one of three chance to generate either rock paper or scissors, and then whoever has the winning combination obviously wins. Like everyone knows how rock paper scissors works. So first of all, what you will need. Like someone was asking in the chat that I saw if they needed a laptop. Unfortunately, yes, you do need a laptop for this session, either a Windows or Mac, or if you use Linux, that's good as well. If you're on another device, you can still have access to the Learn platform, which is this platform. You'll have access to it at the end. So during your own spare time, you could do it on a laptop when you have a chance. So it's not a big deal. You will also need to download Sublime Text, or what I use is called VS Code. So it completely depends on what you prefer. I just prefer VS Code because I'm used to it, but everything will work exactly the same on Sublime Text as well. And then finally, there's a Lewagon workshop website that you can access. It's hosted on Notion. And the outcome of today. So as I mentioned, it's a simple rock, paper, scissors generator. So it will look something like this that you see on your right side. So there are two players, and then you click on Let's Play, and then whoever wins, a text will display, saying who wins. So what are we actually learning? Well, first of all, we're learning how to reactivate the button to listen to an event. So we will learn what events are in JavaScript. And then we will also have some conditional logic. So in this case, it will be if rock is, we'll have to assign some kind of value to rock. And then we'll say if rock is greater than scissors or less than scissors, and so on, rock wins and all that. So JavaScript is what we will call a web language. There are currently, you could say, three web languages, which is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But I think it's important to distinguish that HTML and CSS are not programming languages. They're just web languages. But JavaScript is unique in the sense that it is a scripting language. It's a programming language that can be done on your web browser. To prove that, let me just, sorry, one second. To prove that, let's come to our Lewagon website. And then to view the website details, you can just right-click and then click on Inspect. This will bring up this window on your right side. And then inside the console, so up here, you can click on Console. Ignore these errors. These errors come from some extensions on Google Chrome that I have, but you shouldn't have any of them. So basically, we can write JavaScript in the browser itself. So for example, we can say console.log. And then we can write a string here. So a message, we can just say hello world. And then if we were to run this, so click enter, it'll display hello world. And so we can do all kinds of JavaScript. We can do 2 plus 4, it gives us 8 divided by 3. It gives us all kinds of calculations and stuff. So anything you can do with normal programming languages can be done in JavaScript. Again, the main difference being JavaScript can be done on the web browser. Right? So let's move on. Now, before we even had JavaScript, browsers only ran on HTML and CSS. So the whole point of browsers even being implemented, of the internet starting, is when researchers in university wanted to share their research, their papers with each other. So for that time, HTML and CSS was all they needed. But of course, as time went on, the market changed, and we have new new technologies like JavaScript. Back in the day, Netscape was the most popular browser. It, in fact, had 80% of the market share, but it couldn't do any kind of scripting on the browser itself. Now, of course, people got tired of just looking at boring old HTML and CSS, and they decided that they needed programming languages in the browser itself. So back in the day, they of course had programming languages such as C, assembly, and Java, and so on. But those programming languages cannot be run on the web browser. So they wanted those same functionalities, just like I showed you, just like addition and subtraction and having variables and all that. They wanted to have that on the browser. And so came JavaScript. So with JavaScript, one of the main things it was used for when it was first released was for pop windows. So if anyone, I don't know if anyone's here of that age, but if you remember the early days of the internet, whenever you went to any website, there were like a million pop-ups that like popped up. They asked you to donate, they asked you to use this and that. And that's what JavaScript was used for, like when it first released. Now, then Internet Explorer, which is owned by Microsoft, they actually reverse engineered JavaScript and they called it JScript. So back then, JavaScript was not in a public domain, so not everybody could use it. It was basically tied down to web browsers. And because JavaScript was such a revolutionary thing, every browser wanted its own form of JavaScript. And so every browser basically raced to create their own version. And so from 1996 to 2009, we had something called the browser wars, where basically every browser was making their own version of JavaScript. They were trying to make it better than their competition and, of course, have the higher market share. Now, I found this fascinating picture the other day, which basically shows sorry, one second. Yeah, it basically shows the most popular browsers back in 2012 and in 2022. So as you can see, in 2012, it was more diverse. So if you're in Dubai right now, back then, Internet Explorer was the most popular browser. In Kazakhstan, which is where I am right now, the most popular browser was Opera, and so on. But nowadays, it's all about Google Chrome. Everybody loves Google Chrome, except Greenland. And if you see down here, Equatorial Guinea are the only ones who use Microsoft Edge. How did that happen? Well, there was something called the Renaissance back in 2009. That's when Google Chrome's V8 engine came, and it had support for Node.js. It had support for brand new frameworks. Google actually made their own framework called Angular, which is a little logo here. That's Angular, which is a framework made with JavaScript for the browser. And it was very popular. They were able to make so many great web apps and web applications using Angular. And so basically, Google Chrome just went ahead. And the popularity of JavaScript exploded thanks to Google Chrome. Now, why is JavaScript actually popular? It's not just because of browsers, of course. The features themselves is what makes JavaScript what it is. Now, one of the main reasons JavaScript is the most popular out there is because of its functionality to be able to use as both front-end and back-end developing languages. So what front-end is basically whatever we see. So if you look at this web page, everything you see right now, so on the side, all these tabs, all these, the slide themselves, and all these things up here, they're what you call the front end of your browser. So everything that we can see. So basically what looks nice. But the back end is the functionality that happens. So when I click over here and this browser opens, the functionality that makes the browser switch is in the back end. And it's the code that we visually cannot see on the browser, but it's working in the background. And JavaScript is capable of both. Most programming languages back then, such as
excuse me?
C#, yes?
We can see the code by using inspect, right?
Yes, I believe I showed it earlier, but yes, you can. So you can basically just right-click, inspect, and then if you go to the elements, this is where all the code will be. But the only code you can see here is your HTML.
Yeah, HTML code.
All right. Yeah, so as I was saying, back then, the only programming languages that existed, such as C#, Java, and assembly, and so on, they were only back-end languages. That's why if you see any of the technologies from back then, they all looked kind of ugly because all they cared about was the functionality. So nowadays, think of, for example, NFTs. The blockchain technology is actually incredible. Like, it's amazing technology, right? But people didn't really care about them until they put monkeys on like as art and sold it in that form, right? So it's a similar thing. Front end is very important. People love looking at pretty things, and that's why having both front end and back end is such a huge advantage. Next, JavaScript is standardized. So nowadays, one company, like one browser doesn't own JavaScript. Every browser has implementations of JavaScript that they implement themselves. JavaScript itself is owned by Oracle, which also owns Java. But yeah, right now it's free to use with any browser. Any browsers, they can basically use JavaScript as they want. And because of that, it becomes standardized. So every browser has the exact same JavaScript. So no browser has features that other browsers don't have. And JavaScript finally offers a wide range of frameworks. And I think this is the biggest thing for developers, especially. JavaScript became basically the go-to programming language to make web applications. And this includes frameworks such as, I think, yeah, right here, Angular and React. And they basically made making web apps very, very simple. Now let's finally get into the basics of JavaScript. Now, there's a question, I think. Let me just look at a chat and see if there's questions. If you want to ask questions, you can ask them now. So around when did JavaScript become standardized? I believe it was in 2009 when Google Chrome basically made their V8 engine, which basically showcased the power of JavaScript. And then everybody could start using their own version of JavaScript. And basically, if everyone's using one thing, the company that owns JavaScript, Oracle, they realized that having the same standards for every JavaScript that's used out there is probably more advantageous compared to having multiple versions of JavaScript that won't work on some devices than others. Any other questions that you have so far? Very good question.
Yeah.
Yeah. What is the difference between Java and JavaScript? That's a very, very good question. The difference is they're not the same thing. They're completely different. The only thing that's similar between them is their name. So they both have Java in their names. And the reason for this was because when they were making JavaScript, at the time, web browsers weren't so popular. So they basically thought, if we made a scripting language for the web, no one was going to use it because people hate the web browsers, right? Back then, that's how they thought. And so they thought if they basically, at the time, Java was the most popular programming language. And they thought if they borrowed the name Java and they just added script at the end, people will mistake it for Java and they're going to start using it. And it actually worked out because JavaScript is the most popular programming language now. So I'll answer one or two questions and then we're going to move on. Is Django becoming more popular than JavaScript now? If so, why? Django is basically based on Python. So Django is popular if you're using it alongside machine learning or similar technologies, AI technologies. That's where Django comes in. But I think one misconception people have, Django still uses JavaScript. So Django still cannot function on the front end side without JavaScript, and you can still function with JavaScript at the back end. So just because you use Python doesn't mean you cannot use JavaScript. So last question, Python is a type of coding robot language, right? It's basically Python is just a programming language exactly like JavaScript, but Python is basically more focused on like the mathematical side, I guess you could say, more on machine learning, AI, and so on. So more on scientific stuff. But it can do the exact same thing that JavaScript can, except run on the browser. All right, so let's move on. Now you can hold off your questions until the next time. So first of all, variables. So variables, one more thing. To run my JavaScript, I'm going to use JSBin, which is a free tool you can use on your browser. And I'm going to use it for basically because just to show you how JavaScript works. So variables, this is a very important concept in programming languages. So the way to declare variables in JavaScript, there are two ways. First is to say let, and then give the name of the variable. So for example, you can say name and then give it a value, right? In this case, I'm just going to give my own name, Hamza. And the other way to declare variables is to use const. And then we can say DOB for date of birth. And then we can just give it a number of 1998, right? So these are both variables, but they work a little bit differently in JavaScript. The reason we need both of them is because variables are dynamic values, so they can be changed. So for example, if I was to, let me just console.log, which is how you can view something on the console, and I can console log my name, right? If I run this, it's going to say Hamza. But now, if I keep that line there, but I say let name, or I don't even have to say let, I can just say name equals to, and I change it to make, let's say Alex. And then if I was to run this now, let me just clear it first. And if I run it, it's going to say Alex. Even though it says Hamza here, it still ran Alex. That's because we're basically overwriting the value of name over here. With const, it's the opposite. It's impossible to change the value of const. So if we try doing that, if we try doing GOB and we say, let's say Alex was born in 2001, and then we're going to log GOB. Then let's clear this, run. It's going to give us an error because it says assignment to constant variable. Const basically cannot be changed. So the fact that I'm changing it here is giving me an error. So those are the main differences. So basically just remember, I would recommend always using const. Always use const when you're making your variables, unless you know explicitly that you want to change them later. So if you want to change them, for example, like the name here, then it's absolutely fine to use let. But 90% of your variables are going to be using const. And so, yeah, variables are basically ways to store data. It can be, we have a few data types in JavaScript. First of all, we have numbers. So for example, 23, 3.5, like 2.4, whatever. These are all numbers. So if you're familiar with other programming languages, this would be an integer and this would be like a floating or a double. But in JavaScript, they're all numbers. So to prove that, we can just say type of, right? And then we can say 43 here. And then we have to console log it. And I think I made a mistake because I did its type. Oh. See if I clear and I run. Oops, type of. See, it's a number. So 43 is a number, but if I put it 43.87 and I run this, it's still a number. So there's no differentiation between integers and floating point numbers in JavaScript. The next is strings. So strings are basically denoted by these double curly braces. Double quotes. They can also be single quotes or even back quotes. They're all a string. Typically, we use double quotes. Some people prefer single quotes. It's absolutely up to your preference. So for example, again, if I just put my name here, and if I clear this and I run, it's a string, right? Now, one thing you have to remember, even if it's empty, but there are quotes on it, it's still considered a string. So it's not a null, or in some programming languages, it can be a null, it can be undefined, but in JavaScript, it's always a string. Cool. And then finally, of course, we have Boolean numbers. So that's true and false. So of course, this just return you true. It's Boolean. So true and false. All right. So I misspelled that. False. That's all you have to know for now for your variables. Now let's actually play around with our code. To do that, firstly, you can do this on your own time. You don't have to follow along. But basically, in the setup right here, when you will be onboarded on the platform, you would find a download for the boilerplate. You can just right-click on it, or sorry, you can just open your Sublime Text or VS Code, and you can just drag that folder in, and you're going to get these files. So you're going to get an asset file for your images and stuff. You can ignore it for now. the things we're concerned with is the HTML file, the JavaScript file, and the CSS file. Now, we wrote a lot of code for you already because this is a JavaScript course and we want you to focus on the JavaScript, right? But to open and to actually view this in the web server, I'm going to right click and say open with live server, right? It's gonna open up like this. You don't have to open the link now. You can do it afterwards. You can just follow, watch me do it for now. But basically, this is the page you're gonna get, right? So right now it's fully static. It's purely made out of HTML and JavaScript. Sorry, HTML and CSS. There's no JavaScript. So if I press this button, nothing happens. There's absolutely nothing happening here. But this is a boilerplate that we have prepared for you. And of course, we'll be only working with the JavaScript file over here. We've already written a bunch of code for you. So your job is only to fill them out and practice. All right, let's move on. So yes, as I mentioned, our site is static. And that's not fun because we want a game, right? We want to actually be able to play this. So we want to click this and for something to happen. So let's see how we do that. Now, first, before we do that, there's a very important concept of how does JavaScript even interact with HTML? Because yes, we have HTML on our browsers and we have JavaScript that's written on a separate page. Now, how do these two elements even interact with each other? Well, for them to interact, we need something called the DOM, or the document object model. Now, what this is basically the interpreted state of your HTML. And that's a very specific wording. Now, to see that, let's actually go back to Lewagon's website. And you see, like, let me just close this and refresh. This is the page. And if I right click and click on inspect, this thing is going to open. Now, this is the DOM. So what I mentioned, the document model is simply the HTML that's on your page. Now, why I use specific wording saying this is the interpreted state of HTML is because the state of HTML actually changes based on your JavaScript. So for example, if we highlight this button right here, right? So as you see here, this is div class and it has all these classes on it. Now, if I was to hover over it, do you see that? Do you see the classes changing? That's because the state of HTML changes itself. So in this case, it's a certain type of state of HTML. And then thanks to JavaScript, when we hover over it, there's another state of HTML. So that's why it's very important distinction that DOM is not simply the HTML, is the interpreted state of HTML. Cool, so let's move on. Now that we've made that distinction, now we want to know, how do we actually manipulate this DOM? Now we want to actually make changes on it. Well, to make changes to the DOM itself are all these elements, right? So if we right click again, inspect, all these elements, such as the div here, like if I was to basically hover over this card, all of these divs are on this page. So we basically, what we want to do is select the specific elements through their classes or through their IDs, or even through the class name, through the HTML tag, and we want to manipulate it in JavaScript. Now, how do we select these elements? Well, we can use their ID. So if you see in this JavaScript page that we provided you, there's already in the HTML file, we already have given IDs to things, right? So for example, this div is called player1, right? And that player1 div is basically, let me just open that page, 1 second. And it's right here. So this element, we want it to change basically based on our ID. So let's do that, right? So the code for that is document.getElementById to select the element in our JavaScript. So here, again, the first line is done for us. So document.getElementById, which is player1. And we're taking that element that we have selected from the DOM, and we are placing it in to a variable called player1. So let's do the exact same thing here for player 2. What we want to do is get the element from the DOM. To do that, we just say document, which is the DOM, dot get element by ID, brackets, and inside here, we have to specify the ID. Now, if you look at the HTML, here is player 2. And for player 2, you can see the ID that we have already given it is player 2. So we basically just copy paste that. Now remember, the ID depends on whatever you name it. So if you name this like, I don't know, ABC or something, that's what you have to mention in your DOM. But of course, we want to be as specific as possible because we want other people who look at our code to actually understand what's going on. Here, we can just paste this, player 2. We can save this. And let's just quickly do that for all of these and actually have our DOM selected. So here, for result area, if you take a look, this is the result area. And the ID for it is just simply result area. So here, result area, we can just replace this. In our HTML, finally, the button just has the ID of play button. Right, save that. And if we go back to our page, one second, sorry. Yeah, if we go to this page, nothing really changed right now, right? And the reason is because we just selected the elements themselves. Because once we've selected them, now we can work on them in our JavaScript. So it's always important to remember, you have to select the elements first. So that's your first step, is to select the elements. Now we have selected all the elements. And we have stored them into our variables. Now, how do we check our work actually, how do we check out it actually worked? Well, here we wrote a little code here called console log. Basically, console log player 2, result area, and play button. Before, when you came to this page, when you came to this page and we right-click inspected it, and if we go to console, you can see all these elements, such as player 2, result area, and play button, are now highlighted for us. And I can prove that this is the line that's doing it by commenting it out. And if I was to refresh this page, nothing happens. See, you see nothing here. But if I comment it out again, all the IDs, all the elements are here. So we've done it. We've proven that, we've selected all the elements that we want to actually manipulate, that we want to work on. So these three are the things we want to work on. Cool. Now we've selected it. Now the first step is done, which is declaring our variables. Now, up to this point, what questions do you guys have? Write them in chat. Yeah, people are having issues with extracting the boilerplate. Basically, what you want to do is download it. So if you go to setup here, so if you go setup, you just click on here and it'll download a zip file, and you only extract the JavaScript file, and then you open it in your, wherever you want to open it, in Sublime Text or in VS Code. Yeah, a little knowledge of JavaScript is plenty for our session. Don't worry. Any other questions? No? No questions? Yeah, the code I changed was basically here. We've basically highlighted everything, because the first step is our variable. So here, I basically changed here. I selected the specific elements from our DOM. All right, if you guys are having problems with the zip file, we can talk about it after the lecture, right? But yeah, the download button, like if you go to setup and you just click on this, that should download the file for you. And I believe if once you download it, you just click on it and you get these two folders, Mac OS and JavaScript. You just click on JavaScript and you extract it to, I don't know, desktop or whatever. I don't want to replace that because I already have that file. But you basically extract it, and then to open it in your VS Code, if this is your desktop and this is the folder, you can just right-click on it and you can say open with code. I think if you guys are having problems with opening the code, maybe you don't have Sublime Text or VS Code installed, and maybe that's the issues you're having. Right? So let's move on with the lecture. I think this was 23. Yep. Cool. So the next topic we're going to talk about is event listeners. So as we mentioned earlier, we want a certain event to happen to our elements. So the elements that we have selected, such as the button and these elements, we wanted to actually change based on some kind of interactivity. And this interactivity comes from our event listeners. Now what? So this is our site now, right? It does not react to any user action. You can keep poking it. As I said, you can keep clicking on things. Like here, you can keep clicking on things, but nothing will happen. And that's because we haven't actually added any interactivity to it yet. We just selected certain elements that we want the interactivity to happen on. So what we need is an event listener, or a reaction, as we like to call it. Basically, what it does, it listens to the event in the DOM. So in this case, we have specific events such as click, key up, scroll, and there are many, many more. I would recommend going it to just searching MDN events. This is the events reference, and they give you basically all the. Let me just scroll down. Yeah, like here, they give you all the events that you can do. So, for example, key down, there's key up, as I said, there's scroll, and there's so many different events that you can work on. So usually, but like 90% of events are usually click, key up, or scroll. So click is obvious. It's when you click something, and that doesn't have to be a button. It can be any element on the page. It can be the page itself. Key up is when you click on a key on your keyboard, and when the key is lifted, a certain action will take place. Scroll is simply when you're scrolling the page and some sort of action will happen. So for example, if you've been on any like web pages and you scroll down and like a pop-up happens and it tells you to sign up for their newsletter or to buy something, they usually use the scroll event for that. And reactions are simply functions, but we'll cover functions a little bit later. So let's actually add an event listener to our button, right? So the syntax to add event listener is to, first of all, select the element. So in this case, it's play button. Then we do dot add event listener. So this is our method, add event listener. And add event listener takes two parameters inside. The first is your event type. So in this case, it's going to be click, but you can also, as I said, you can have scroll, you can have key up, you can have a key down, and so on. And finally, we have the function itself. So in this exercise, we've actually written the function for you because it's a lot of just random math, and this math doesn't come from anything JavaScript specific. This math just comes from just knowing programming languages and so on. So we've already written it for you, so you don't have to worry about it. All we have to do is actually add the event listener here. So to do that, again, we want to do it on our button. Why do we want to do it on our button? Because we want, let me just open the page again. Sorry, it's not opening. Yeah. When we are on our page, we don't want an action to happen when we click over here, right? Or when we click over here. We want the action to only happen when we click on this button. That's why we're selecting the button here. So let's do that. Now to select the button, we've given it a variable called play button. So we can just call it here. So we can just say play button, right? And we can do dot, then add event listener, right? Bracket. The first parameter is the event type. So in this case, we want it on click. So we want when we click the button for something to happen. Now, what do we want to happen when we click the button? Well, we want the function of play to happen, which is the function written here. We will go through what the function does, but this is the simple syntax for writing our event listeners. Oops. Yep. Let's save that. There's nothing yet here. Now we created our event listener. And now it's finally time for functions, because functions are a way to actually add the code that's going to interact with the DOM, right? Before that, does anyone have any questions regarding event listeners? No? Okay, I don't see any questions, so I'm just going to move on. If you have any questions, don't worry, you'll have a chance to ask at the end of the session. So now functions. Now functions are, as I mentioned, they're a way to add basically programming logic to our file. And the way functions work, again, let's come back to JSBin so I can actually show you how functions are written. Now functions used to be written a little bit differently, but since 2015, a new version of JavaScript came out called ES6. And ES6 basically modernized the way we write JavaScript. So the way we write JavaScript are a little like more crisp. They're more like logical. So if you go on the internet and you look at some legacy JavaScript code, they're going to look a little different, especially the event listeners and such. So here to call a function, first of all, we have to give the function a name. For that, we say const. So just like we made variables, we can call our functions using const. Let's give our functions a name. So let's just call it a function, right? Because that's what it is. Or we can just say, not to be confused, let's just call it do this. So this function just does that. And then we're going to equal it to, and then add a parentheses. And inside the parentheses is where we basically put our parameters. Now, functions should be familiar to you if you use things like other programming languages. It's basically parameters and arguments are what you're giving here. So the parameter I'm going to give, basically the parameter is a variable that's going to be changed within this function. So for example, let's say what we want this function to do is to uppercase, right? Let's just call it uppercase. What we want this function to do is to take a string. So any string, we can write whatever we want. And we want that string to all be uppercased. To do that, first, let's give it a parameter. So we'll have a parameter of string, right? Or we can say just text. It's going to be a text. And then the next thing you have to do is called an arrow function. So it's basically, or a fat arrow, you give an equal sign and then greater than sign. And then curly braces. And within these curly braces is where we actually write the logic of our code. So what we want to do is whatever argument we give it, right? So for the text, we want it to uppercase. And to uppercase is simply a method that uppercases all of the text. That's all we wanted to do. Now, one thing you have to remember, when you're writing functions, you always have to return inside of the function. Now, some programming languages such as Python and Ruby, you don't have to return. It automatically returns the last line that you write. But in JavaScript, it's required to return on the last line. Cool. Now, how do we actually call this function? Well, first of all, let's do console log because we want this thing to show up inside our console over here. And then we're going to call the function, which is uppercase, right? Now, if we just call it like this, what will happen? Well, nothing, right? it'll just returns the entire function. That's not what we want. We want a certain text to be uppercased. And for that, we need to give an argument. So an argument is basically what this text, right? What this text is supposed to be, right? So in this case, I'm going to give it a string, and let's give it a string like hey, hello, right? Then we give it right? We're going to jumble it up like that. Now, when we run this function, we expect this string to all be uppercase. So let's clear this. Let's run it. And there you go. Hello world. Our function works. So basically, again, to reiterate, a function is basically a piece of reusable code. Now, why is this reusable? Well, if I wanted to just copy this line, right? And I want to use a different sentence with it, right? So let's say I just give my own name, right? So they're all lowercase, and I want them uppercase. So if I clear this and I run it, they both run at the same time, but they run different text inside, but they apply the same logic to it. And that's the use case for our functions, is basically applying some type of logic that's reusable. Now, of course, this line of code can be written by itself, but when it's written by itself, it's not reusable. When it's written inside a function, it can be reused as many times as you want with different arguments. So yeah, as I mentioned, what's the function? It's a machine that has inputs and outputs. As I said, the inputs are basically what we give here, and the output is what they return. And each function, remember, should be very simple. Like, as you see here, this does only one thing. This function only uppercases text. That's all it does. That's all its function. You don't want it doing multiple things. You don't want it to uppercase and then cut the text and then have a word limit on it. You don't want it to do multiple things. You only want it to usually have to do only one thing. Yeah, it's repeatable code that's easier to read. Now, let's look at the functions that we have written for you. Thankfully, in this lesson, you do not have to write your own functions because we've written them for you. Simply for the to basically save time, and also because these functions are a little bit more advanced, you could say. So, for example, in this case, we have a function called generate choice. So, as you noticed, as I mentioned, we write const first, then the name of the functions, whatever you want to name it. In this case, there's a bracket, but there's no parameter inside. That means this line of code does something, but it's not dependent on any kind of input. Then inside, we just do some math. So we're doing a math. We're selecting a random number. We're timing it by 3. And the whole point of doing this is so that we can play some rock, paper, scissors, right? And as you see, this generate choice function is then called over here. And remember, if there's nothing within these brackets, the bracket should still be here when you're calling the function, but you don't need to put in anything inside the brackets. So you can still have empty brackets. Nice. So yeah, we've generated choices here. The next thing to look at is about conditionals. Now, before we get into conditionals, does anyone have any questions? Let me just open up the chat. Yeah. So you guys are clear about how functions work, I hope. Okay, nice. Okay, there's a question about comparisons. Let me just get into it and I will answer that, all right? So now conditionals, so our booleans and so on, so giving us value of true and false and stuff. Now I had a question of why do we use 3 equal signs? Well, 3 equal signs, if you remember basic math, 1 equals to 1, we just put 1 equals to sign. The equivalent of that in JavaScript is to put 3 equal to signs. Now, when you put 2 equals to signs, it's used for assignments and such. That's why it won't work. So you need to use 3 here.
Excuse me?
Yes?
But in HTML, we use two equal signs, two and signs, two or signs, and all those, right?
Yes, exactly, it does.
Okay. Not three.
But it's just like quirks of the language. So there's no actual like logic to it. It's just the way the programming language was written, and we just have to use it. We just have to accept it. If you put 1 equals to in JavaScript, that's a assignment. So right here, you see how we're assigning value data to this variable is when we use a single equals to sign. So it's a assignment. So you don't want to use a single one. So yeah, let's get into our conditionals. Let's do a little bit here. Right. So our conditionals. So first of all, there's the if operator. Now, I don't know if you guys are familiar with other programming languages. They should be very familiar to you. To write an if statement, you just say if. Then inside the brackets, you give your condition, right? So for example, let's say let's make a constant, right? And then let's say, sorry, name. And then this name is equals to Hamza. So that's my name. Now let's say if name is equal to Hamza, right? So if this is true, so if this is true, we want to console log. Let's just say, or let's just console log true. But in a case where that's not true, so that means the else statement. And to write it, we just say else, and then just brackets. So we don't have to. So that means if this condition, so if name is equals to Hamza, and if that's true, please console log true. If it's false, please console log false. Oops, I misspelled that. False. Save that. If we run that, it gives us true because our name is Hamza. But if I was to change this to Ahmed and I was to run it, it will give us false. So it's just really hot. I'm just sweating a little bit. But yeah, it basically gives us false because it's not equal to anymore, right? So that's how you use if or else statements. Now, a continuation to that is to use else if. That means if you have more than one condition. So let's say, let's put this in a new line. Here, let's say else if, right? And we make a special condition. So the condition here will be if name is equal to, let's say, Alex, then curly braces, and we want to say console log. Let's say, for example, we'll print a string saying the name is Alex, right? So this condition will only ever run. Sorry. So this condition will only ever run if the name is Alex. So if we clear this, we run it. Oh, I forgot a curly brace somewhere. Let me just make sure.
It's the else F.
Oh yeah, sorry. Oh yeah, sorry. This is, yeah, that's my bad. This is the syntax for Ruby, which is what we teach in Lewagon. So I'm more used to Ruby, so I forgot. But yeah, that was the syntax for Ruby. So let me just clear that and run that. That'll be false because the name is Hamza, it's not Alex. But if I was to say Alex here, and I was to run it, it'll give us a string called the name is Alex. So this is a way to have multiple conditions. Now let's take a look at our functions. Oh, one thing else. that I want to show you is basically your operators, right? So we have 3 types of different like operators in JavaScript. So for example, we can say there's the AND operator, there is the OR operator, and there's the NOT, right? So to simply show you that, let me just, sorry, I cannot, JS and operator, because I want to show you a table. Let me just find it here of the operators, right? So the way operators of Boolean logic works for AND operators. So if you're familiar with math or if you've done engineering or something, this is like simple thing for you. But basically, the thing you have to remember with AND operators, if both logics are true, only then, sorry, if both logics are true, only then will the outcome be true. In any case, if there's even one false, it'll always be false. Whereas with OR operators, either one has to be true for the outcome to be true. So if both of them are false, only then will something be false. So how does that actually like translate into our code, right? So let's say if we say if, right, we make another if statement, and let's say if our age is between 18, if our age is more than 18 and less than 24, right? So in that range, let's say we're a young adult, for example. So let's write that logic. So first of all, I want to make a variable. So let's make a variable called age. And I'll put my age, which is 23. And let's say if our age is more than 18, right? And the age is less than 24. In this condition, let's say we wanted to console log, you are a young adult. I don't know if that's actually true. I don't know the age changes for young adults, but let's just assume that's the case, right? Then else, so let's make an else if actually. So let's say else if age is more than 1. Actually, else if age is more than 24, or age is less than. Actually, I'm making it too complicated. Let's just run this first. So else, just say console.log, and let's just say you are not a young adult, right? So let's just run this. Let's say I'm a young adult because I am 23. But if I was 46, it'll tell me I am not a young adult. So that's the AND operator. So in this case, as you saw, both of them have to be true. So the age has to be more than 18 and it has to be less than 24. So if I was to say or here, that means either one of them is true. So that means if you're over 18 or if you're over less than 24, this statement is true. But we'll run into a problem here because it'll tell me I'm a young adult even though I'm 46. That's because one of the conditions has been met. The condition that you're over 18 has been met. Even if the condition that if you're 6, the condition that you are less than 24 is true. So it's going to give us the true value anyway. So that's how and or works. Right? So now let's take a look at the code we've written for you. And let's actually dissect it so that we know what's going on. Even though you guys don't have to write it, it's still good to know what's going on under the hood. So here is a function. Over here is a function called decide winner. And this is a function that would basically calculate who the winner is, right? Because there are 3 outcomes in rock, paper, scissors. You either win, you either lose, or it's a tie. And so we can write conditionals based on it to return a certain thing, right? So for example, if we have inside this function, we have an if statement, and we're saying, and we're giving a parameters of A and B. And A and B are going to be your two players. So it's going to be player 1 and player 2, or choice 1 and choice 2. So if A is equals to rock and B is equals to rock, so what does this mean? That means both of them are true, right? So and you notice we're not using or statements here because these are definitive. Both of them have to be true, right? So both player 1 and player 2 has to have rock for it to be what? What happens when there's a rock and a rock? Or as you see here, we're actually extending our logic, and we're saying, or if paper and paper is true, or scissor and scissor is true. But these or statements are basically telling us if any one of these is true, right? So if any one of these lines are true, then execute this line. So in this case, if it's rock, rock, if it's scissor, scissor, if it's paper, paper, it's a draw. So we can say returns, we can say it's a tie. Now you see a problem here. When I used a single quotation mark, it actually gave me an error because I'm using quotation marks here as well. So to exit that, you can just use a back slash. That means if we're get two scissors, two rocks, and so on, it's going to be a tie, right? Our next condition. Now, first of all, if A is a rock and B is scissors, then what is the outcome? If one is this and one is that, player 1 wins, right? Otherwise, if this paper and let's just say A is player 1, B is player 2. If the player 1 has paper and player B has rock, then player 1 wins. So in this case, we want it to return player 1 wins, right? In any other situation, so in else, well, we want player 2 to win because that's the only other outcome that's left, right? So if player 1 doesn't win, that means player 2 has won. And so those are our outcomes. Those are our conditions. And here we have a function called play, and it simply has two choices, right? So there's generated choice, which is this math that we're using here. It's giving us a certain value, right? There's two values. And then we're calling decide winner, which is this function. And we're giving it choice 1 and choice 2. So we're giving it out of 3. So there's 1, 2, or 3. 1 is equal to, basically what this math did was it made it so 1 is equal to rock, 2 is equals to paper, and 3 is equals to scissors. So it's always randomly chosen. Whatever is chosen, right? So players 1's choice, whatever is generated here, and players 2 choice, whatever is generated there, the numbers are compared. Or in this case, the emojis actually, they're compared, and then they're basically compared, and then the winner is given to us because we're calling it with the add event listener. There's a question in chat that says, for the first if statement, could you just say if A equals to B? No, because the reason being, in this case, we're specifically using emojis. So on the page here, we're using emojis. So you have to use emojis to actually, because your code can't really differentiate between them, right? So we've written the code. Let's refresh this. And let's actually click let's play. And there we go. Something happened. Player 1 won because player 1 chose scissors and player 2 chose paper. Let's play again. Player 1 chose rock, player 2 chose paper, so player 2 won. Both of them chose paper this time, and it's a tie. And we can keep playing it and keep getting different outcomes. And so that is our code in essence. That's our game. So we made our final product, of course. Our final product is looking nice. So yeah, we can just keep selecting different, like we can keep playing it. And of course, this is a very simplified version. This is randomly generated by chance. So this is not the most advanced version of the game, but this is a good starting place to basically get an idea of how JavaScript works. There's a question in chat that says the last part, which says const play is a function that initiates the game. Yes, absolutely. That's what it does. So here, so we have this play function, right? Well, this play function is being executed over here. So we're calling it here. So we're saying so we're selecting the button and we're saying, listen to an event. So listen to an event of click. The event is click. So that means when the button is clicked, we want this function to be run. Does that make sense? Another question, can we do without the blue brackets? So you mean these brackets? They're essential in JavaScript. Sorry, they're not essential. I mean, in this case, they're essential because we have multiple conditions, right? So this is by itself one condition, right? And then we're chaining other conditions to it. That's why we're using brackets there, to basically help separate them. Any other questions, guys? Are you able to use structures like arrays in JavaScript? Absolutely. So let me quickly cover that because that's not part of the lecture, but I can cover that in JSBin. So arrays are basically a collection of a bunch of data, right? So for example, let's make an array. Again, we can just say const, and let's name our array. Let's see here. Let's say teachers. I'm just gonna shout out my fellow teachers, and we can make an array. And to make an array is just simply have square brackets, and inside the square brackets we can have as many items as we want. So for example, the first teacher is Hamza, and second teacher, oops, let's say Ahmed, let's say Zaifa, right? And so on and so on. And yeah, Tariq. So we have different teachers here. So this is called an array. And on array, we can have different functions as well. So one of those functions that I think would be cool to show you guys is the for each loop. So it's basically iterating over each item in this array and giving us a certain outcome. That means if I wanted to, like, let's say, if I wanted to, I could just say, Ahmed is the best, right? And then if I was to console log this, oops, if I was to console log this, let me just open the console log this, then run. It's going to say Ahmed is the best teacher or is the best. But I wanted to say each one of these people are the best. So I wanted to say I'm the best. I wanted to say Ahmed, Josepha, and Tariq, they're the best. So I wanted to do a certain action several times. So what I can do is iterate over this teachers array. So I can say teachers dot for each. That means for each one of these items, so for Hamza, for Ahmed, for Josepha, for Tariq, for each of these items, do something, right? Now I can give it a parameter, and let's call it teacher, right? Because it just makes sense. A singular item is a single teacher. And then I can say, I believe it's like this. And then I can say, just console.log. And let's see, inside here, I can say teacher, right? Like I could calculate plus is the best. So let's save that. I'm not sure what the error is here. There's a dot somewhere. Okay, I think it's supposed to be like this. Is it like this? Sorry, I'm forgetting the syntax here, which is like syntax is basically how something is written. And I'm forgetting it because I have not used JavaScript in a while. Okay, this is actually the perfect time to tell you guys how to how to work through certain problems, right? Like, let's say you're having a problem, you forgot the syntax for something. Now, this happens all the time. Trust me, as programmers, if any of you have coded before, it's very hard to remember things. So we can just go to Google and we can Google it, right? So we can say JavaScript arrays. So let's just open this link. And arrays, and specifically, I'm looking for each, right? For each. So over here, I can do for each. And inline callback, arrow function. Right, then let's take a look. Let's take a look how they're using it. They're actually using a square, a thing. Sorry, where's my? Yeah, over here, they're just using a arrow like that. And so this is supposed to be a curly brace, I believe. Cool. Right, let's take a look. Yep, they're using curly braces, and then inside they're giving us the run. Oh, and there's supposed to be a bracket here. Clear, run, and there we go. Now our function works. So again, if you forget how to write something, always Google it. Trust me, Google is your best friend, as any developer would tell you. The difference between a good and the best developers are a good developer knows things, how to code things, but the best developers know how to Google those things. All right, so I think that's the end of our lecture.